All right, Fiona Schaeffer, thank you so much for joining us for this ABA Spring Antitrust Meeting interview series.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to get started, given your experience with new and emerging technologies and artificial intelligence, there's some recent developments that we're seeing in the administration, bringing on some of the most powerful AI companies and superscalers to kind of serve in an advisory role. Meanwhile, we're also seeing this development of this effort, to preempt state regulation in favor of a federal standard. I wonder if you can talk about the implications from a competition standpoint, and perhaps also the risk that this could further entrench the dominance of some of these very powerful companies.
Well, these are really interesting compound questions.
I-
I think one of the premises here that you're raising is that regulation is something that can be geographically confined. So we're talking federal versus state and what is better.
Mm-hmm.
The way I'm looking at this is there's really a question of what will be done globally.
Mm.
I don't see really any realistic prospect of a global regulator for AI, but I do think looking at AI regulation in territorial dimensions is really a one-dimensional chess game. I think when we're looking at the power of AI and the impact of AI, it does cross geographic boundaries, and federal versus state really is not the question. I think the question is, what is China doing versus the US versus the EU, and how is that all going to shake out globally?
So to the extent that we're not going to see any kind of globally coordinated regulation, does the vacuum raise the risk of perpetuating anti-competitive markets?
Well, nature does abhor a vacuum. I do think there's an interesting natural experiment when we look at how Europe has regulated, digital 1.0, and how we see, frankly, a lack of innovation in Europe versus the US. Now, it's hard to see what's correlative versus causative, but there certainly are some arguments for regulation impeding pro-competitive innovation. There's also, some would argue, ways in which the lack of regulation may impede new entry. I think the jury is still out on these questions.
Is it too early? Do you think the technology itself is too early and too poorly understood? Do you think the agencies are capable of leading here?
I think one of the big challenges we have is that the whole legal framework that we have, not only in antitrust, but our legal system generally, if you think about torts law and how we attach liability to the actions of humans, I don't know how fit for purpose it is in a world of agentic AI agents.
How do you mean?
Well, what I mean is let's think about the law of collusion, which requires a conscious commitment to a common scheme by human actors. If we think about how that applies in the world of agentic AI, we have, what some have called little creatures running around that are created by us, trained by us, but just like our offspring are not, once they reach teenage and adult levels, controlled by us.
Right.
And so those agents are also super smart, and I think they could independently determine, perhaps without any explicit coordination with their brethren, the other agentic AI agents, that a collusive outcome is preferable for each of them than a competitive one.
But for business purposes, or
yes, but there's no conscious commitment to a common scheme there. There's no really illegal conduct to which you could attach some kind of relief or remedy.
Because to prove collusion, you would have to show that there was an agreement, a deliberate...
express or implicit, yes.
Okay.
So I think that's just one example of how our law that is designed for human interactions and agents is not necessarily fit for purpose in a world where we will have artificial agents acting to some extent on our behalf, but to some extent independently.
So what I'm saying is we have, for example, I mentioned earlier the president's kind of advisory board of a lot of these AI companies, superscalers and that kind of thing. I wonder when they get together and talk about things like safety, if that raises potentially antitrust liability, talking about exclusive agreements of that kind.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would necessarily see collusion as the primary concern there. Obviously, where you have private actors discussing what are safety standards, and within a voluntary industry framework, you may not reach the same determinations on what safety is versus having government intervention. I think we're seeing that play out in some of the cases we see now in Tech 1.0, which we are now seeing social media challenges to social media platforms based on lack of safety to children.
That's interesting that raises liability in other areas, but by not developing that independently. In your year as chair of the ABA antitrust section, you were very focused on ESG and the intersection of that and competition. I wonder in the year since if you can comment on how that has developed.
That's a great question, Chris. I think at the time we were seeing a US government enforcement environment where there was a real reluctance to develop any guidelines on the intersection between ESG initiatives and the antitrust framework. Where does one begin and the other end? And in particular, I think there was a feeling among the business community that there was a lot of uncertainty in the US about what was permissible and not permissible in the framework of ESG initiatives. Whereas in the rest of the world, we saw a lot of development of affirmative guidelines, in some cases exemptions or public interest recognition that mergers or conduct that promoted more environmentally friendly outcomes could benefit the public and be at least competitively neutral, or in some cases pro-competitive, even if in the markets concerned there wasn't necessarily a direct impact. So we didn't see the same kind of approach in the US. We saw really an absence of guidance on what was permissible for companies to do collectively as ESG initiatives. And in the time since then, we've seen some real concerns raised initially by state AGs and then federally about the use of ESG initiatives as potentially an anti-competitive device. So I think all of that is to say the law and policy here is pretty uncertain at best. I don't think it's an environment that's really promoted a lot of use of ESG initiatives, and in a way that is a real shame, in my opinion. What I do see now with this current energy crisis we're facing is a real opportunity to re-examine what we want to do on climate change and how we collectively can take action that will have some effect. I do think this energy crisis we're now seeing, like any crisis, is a great opportunity to examine what we collectively can and should do to address what are going to be, I think, very significant energy challenges going forward.
Fiona, thank you so much for your time. It was such a privilege and pleasure talking with you.
You too, Chris. I really enjoyed our conversation, and many questions still unanswered, and I'm sure many more to discuss next year.
Absolutely.